Hello everyone, it's Tuesday and you're watching Within the Frame, where we'll delve deeper into the top stories not only in South Korea but across the globe. I'm Kim Bo-kyung. Last Monday, the government announced a set of measures to reform the 52-hour workweek system. The 52-hour system was introduced in 2018. This limited overtime work to 12 hours, which led to companies voicing complaints over a lack of flexibility. The new policy drawn up by the Labor Ministry was to let companies manage overtime not just on a weekly basis, but in many different ways, like monthly and quarterly. This would enable companies to increase their maximum weekly hours to 69 while keeping average work hours within the 52-hour limit. Yet, labor unions have been voicing concerns over workers' health as the plan would eventually lead to longer working hours. This prompted President Yoon Suk Yeol to review the plan. For an in-depth analysis of the details of the Labor Ministry's plan and which way the country should go, we invited Oh Kyetaik, Senior Research Fellow at the Korea Labor Institute, on the line. Dr. Oh, welcome to the show.
Good to see you.
And we also have Cho Kyung, professor at Hong University, on the line as well. Professor Cho, welcome and thank you for your time.
Thank you for inviting me.
All right, Dr. Oh, first question to you. President Yoon Suk Yeol instructed the government on Tuesday, that is today, to review its proposed reform of the 52-hour workweek system. Could you first tell us in detail what changes the government was trying to make under this reform?
The most big change is the method of calculating weekly overtime. Now, the period of overtime management is the week, and it is a maximum of 12 hours per week. The government tried to diversify this option from week only to months, quarter, half year, or year. According to this change, the maximum weekly working hour could be up to 69 hours in a week. It also introduced the working hour saving system in which workers can save overtime in the working hour saving account and use this saved working hour as vacation in the future. This system is used in the countries such as the Germany, and then it can be really strategy in the sense that company has the flexibility of utilizing workers' working hours, and the workers can save their working time in a high demand period and then use saved time as vacation in the low demand period. It also introduced way to protect workers' health, such as the minimum resting time. According to this rule, workers have to take a break at least 11 hours before start the next work shift. The Ministry of Employment and Labor also announced that it tried to reduce working hour system such as blanket wage system, in which working hour is not recorded and overtime pay is included in the total wage beforehand. So the overall purpose of this revision is to make Korean working hour system more flexible, but needs some extra effort to protect workers' health.
Right, I see. So increasing the maximum work hour cap to 69 hours per week and protection mechanisms guaranteeing laborers' health seem to be the two main pillars of reform plan. Now, let's first talk about whether protection mechanisms would properly work. Professor Cho, it says the government would make sure that workers would be given 11 hours of uninterrupted rest time when work hours hit the maximum. Do you believe such a mechanism would properly work?
It seems somewhat contradictory because I understand that the government is also considering an alternative proposal which allows workers to forego this 11 hours of uninterrupted rest per day in return for working up to a maximum of 64 hours per week. But even now, there are many workplaces where the current 52-hour upper limit on weekly working hours is not being observed, and not all of them are actually reported. Dr. Oh mentioned this comprehensive wage system, and there are many, many cases where workers actually end up having to agree contractually to essentially forego overtime pay for extra hours worked over and above the legal limit. And so I am not quite sure how the government is actually going to enforce this 11 hours of uninterrupted rest time if they are also going to give as an option the choice to opt out of it if you are being promised 64-hour maximum working hours per week. It seems to me a little bit contradictory.
Right, I see. So there is a contradictory aspect of this plan. Now, Dr. Oh, as another way to guarantee long holidays, the labor minister said it would introduce the so-called working hours savings system, like you mentioned previously. Yet, according to a report, many workers cannot even properly use their existing annual leave. Is this true?
It is very likely to be yes. Especially, it would be the fact in the workplace of small and medium-sized companies. Usually, small and medium-sized companies do not employ enough workforce since they have less power to adjust to demand shift. Therefore, most of them are likely to employ minimum workforce, and then their organizational slack is not thick. Therefore, workers have relatively high burdens and less replaced workers. In this situation, if some workers go on vacation, then other workers in the workplace have to take over the left work. For this reason, workers in the small and medium-sized companies are likely to hesitate to annual leave, and then as a result, annual leave usage rate is low in the medium and small-sized companies. Therefore, it is not enough just open the door to utilize working hour system, working hour saving system. It is needed to let workers can actually use the door of a working hour saving system. For example, we need to make the way of utilizing leaves or vacation in the teamwork system.
Right, I see. But Dr. O, one more question to you. Even if vacations are given to workers afterwards, experts say working the maximum 69 work hours per week could be very harmful to workers, and a period of holiday afterwards cannot guarantee a full recovery of laborers' health. Now, what is your takeaway?
It is hard to say exact effect of longer working hours on workers' health and the effect of vacation on recovery of a worker's health because I'm not a doctor. But it can be said that basically there would be some harmful effects of longer working hour on workers' health. And then there is some limitation of the capacity of a vacation to release this harmful effect on workers' health. Surely, this effect would be differ depending on many factors such as the content of jobs and how work is done and physical environment working conditions. For example, usually office work is less likely to influenced by the longer working hours compared to the blue-collar jobs. However, if office work continue too much long time, it would also have a negative effect on workers' health. If the work is done in the condition of hot and humid, then workers would be more influenced by longer working hours compared to the work in the conditions of neat and cozy conditions. The capacity of a vacation to recover fatigue from longer working hour is depending on how much work is negatively influenced by longer working hours. If the negative effect is not that strong, then vacation can recover some of this fatigue effect. However, it is too strong, then the recovery factor of vacation would be decreased.
Right, I see. So impact on workers' health could be different depending on the working conditions and environment, but there seems to be a certain possibility that it could have negative impact on laborers' health if it's continued for a long time. Right. Now let's turn to what business sectors have been saying about 52 workweek system. Professor Cho, they have been complaining that employers have to face criminal punishment if even one employee works 1 hour more than the mandatory 52-hour per week. They said managing overtime solely on a weekly basis is very inefficient and absurd. What are your thoughts on the need to change the weekly base system?
In theory, yes, the employee can complain if they are being worked 1 hour more than the legal maximum of 52 hours. But in practice, it doesn't really happen like that. Certainly, there is room for flexibility. For example, having an upper limit of 52 hours per week, but having it averaging over more number of weeks. So, for example, you might be working 60 hours per week this week, but next week you are working 40 hours. And so over a 10-week period, it averages out to 52 hours. We could have something like this. But if we had a system where a regular working of 60 or more hours is tolerated, that is clearly going to adversely impact workers' health. Dr. Oh mentioned that as a non-medical person, he's unable to say exactly what affects a workers' health. But actually, we have a pretty good guideline and standards that are enunciated by our courts and government. If you are working regularly over 64 hours a week, that is recognized as a clear ground for giving rise to cardiological and neurological problems, injuries, adverse impact on health, and recognized also as grounds for industrial injury claims. So we know that long working hours are adversely impacting on workers' health. And if you're talking about 69 hours per week, that's almost double a 40-hour week, which is a fairly kind of average global standard. And so if that's what you need, you really should be hiring more people. Of course, we recognize lots of constraints on the employers as to why that may not be practically possible, especially if you're in a cyclical kind of industry. But in that case, you should actually be able to plan more so that you can hire temporary workers. And so I think we have a little bit of gap between reality and what the government says it's trying to pursue.
Right, I see. Professor Cho, I have one more question to you here. The government says the reason reform should be made is because the 52-hour workweek cap as part of a weekly basis system meant working hours went unpaid because of the comprehensive wage system being used. But what is this about? Could you explain us?
Look, I think that's a bit of a red herring, really, because this comprehensive wage system is, designed to apply to those workers whose work is not really based on number of hours they work. So their productivity is not necessarily correlated to the number of hours they spend on the job, but it could be that they can spend a fewer hours but have a greater output. So somebody who is a specialist or professional, those people are essentially not counting the number of hours, but they're assessed by the output that they produce, and they are remunerated accordingly. And so that's what it's designed to cover. But unfortunately, the system is abused. So ordinary office workers and other employees who should really be paid for the number of hours that they are in the job are covered by this comprehensive wage system, and they essentially end up being forced to agree to forego overtime pay that they would be otherwise entitled to.
Right, I see. Now, Dr. Oh, another reason why the employers welcomed the government's decision was because they expected the revision will increase business efficiency and worker productivity. But do you believe the overhaul of the system will be able to bring about a boost in production and efficiency?
I think the change of working hour system is partially related to the production and efficiency improvement. If the working hour system has more flexibility, then company can utilize working hour with more discretion. Therefore, some company need more working time this week and less working time next week. some other companies need more working time during summer season and need less working time during the winter season. If company can adjust the demand change by more flexible working hour system, it could improve the production efficiency by more discretion on working hours. However, we need to consider more factors in production and efficiency improvement. Production and efficiency improvement is less likely to be achieved only by working hour system. Even though companies has more flexibility in working hour system, it is hardly to increase production and efficiency without other factors such as workplace innovation. Since the workplace innovation needs the cooperation of workers in the process of innovation and then production, so company needs to consider how to cooperate with workers and then how to share performance outcome between company and workers.
Right. So it would be important to consider the flexibility of working hour system, but the companies also need to consider other factors, for example, like the workplace innovation, right? Right. Now, Professor Joe, there were other new changes announced by the government as well, and it said that it will create a new option to allow workers who work for 4 hours to skip their 30-minute break time if they choose to do so, and also said it will come up with policies regarding workers' representatives, including election methods and their authority. What is this about, and what are your thoughts on other new changes?
The current Labor Standards Act mandate that for every 4-hour period worked, you are entitled to half an hour break. And so this 69 hours per week is actually calculated based according to that law. Now, if the company wants to get rid of that half an hour break every 4 hours, they will need to amend the labor standards law, which I think is going to be quite difficult in the current National Assembly, because the government and the party in power doesn't actually have the majority of number of seats in the National Assembly. They are also proposing new method of electing representatives for workers, but that's and they're arguing that existing laws don't really give a proper and detailed procedure as to how these representatives are elected. But that's something that they can totally be left up to the workers themselves. It's not something that necessarily needs to be mandated by law. So I'm not entirely certain as to why the government is trying to really sort of dictate to that kind of degree, except to say that this might be part and parcel of their efforts to try to weaken the grip on labor unions and their representatives. But given that our business in Korea is largely made up of small and medium-sized enterprises, SMEs, 99.9% of companies in Korea are SMEs, and they employ 80% of workers. And in that context, employees are already always at a much less sort of bargaining situation than employers. And so I'm not quite sure why the government is not actually trying to protect the workers more, but rather actually just listening to the employers.
Right. So there could be some questions raised over that aspect. Now, Dr. Oh, South Korea is already notorious for tough working hours, you see, and the average annual working hours for Korean workers came to 1,928 in 2021, which is around 39 days more than OECD average, as far as I know. The government's measures do not seem to have taken this one into consideration. What is your take on this?
I think the revision on working hour is not directly related to total working hours. This revision is not about amount of time of working hour and overtime. It is about how to calculate overtime hours. Under this revision, the prescribed working hour per week is 40 hours, and then the average maximum overtime per week is still 12 hours per week. The different thing is the method and period to calculate overtime. The main purpose of this division is to give more flexibility of Korean working hour system, not to change the amount of working hours. Therefore, the total amount of working hour of Korea would be same between the old and the new working hour system when other things are equal. We can criticize the revision that why it does not try to decrease Korean working hour, which is relatively long compared to the global standard. I think it would be the next step after setting up flexibility of a Korean working hour system, since some workers, like MZ generation, would prefer to shorter working hours if they can finish the work in the short period, and then their compensation level would be same or similar. Therefore, Korean society should start to think how to decrease working hour in short run.
Right. So since you tapped on the voices heard by the millennials and Generation Z, I'd like to go back to President Yoon's remarks. Dr. Oh, President Yoon told the ministry to review the plan, asking them to pay particularly close attention to the opinions of the young generations. What were the focal points addressed by Generation Z, and what changes should be made in your opinion?
After releasing the contentious revision on working hour system, there has been some criticism on the revision. I think that the MZ generation wants more flexibility or flexible working hour system. Young workers have less interest on amount of overtime. Rather, they would have more interest on the flexibility of prescribed working hours. I think they wanted to work less prescribed work time if they can finish the work earlier than the normal working time for the work. But the revision is focused on the overtime, not on the prescribed working time. They also wanted to introduce the method of more flexible ways of organizing working hours, such as flexible work arrangement system and the flexible working hour system. They also try to work on the hybrid working system, which combined the normal commuting system and then telecommuting or work from home system. Therefore, the government tried to collect more information and opinions from workers, especially the young workers, on working hour system. Besides, we need to invest more time and energy to discuss with labor and management side on issues such as what would be expected in the future if working hour system is changed, and what would be the unexpected problems in that situation, and then what we can do overcome those challenges before we start the new working hour system.
Right, I see. We do need to hope that better reform plan could come up since President Yoon Suk Yeol ordered to review the plan. Now, I'd like to ask more questions, but unfortunately, this is all the time we have for today's edition. But thank you, Professor Cho and Dr. Oh, for your insights. We really appreciate it.
Bye.
Thank you.
All right, that's all for Within the Frame tonight. We will be back tomorrow with more in-depth stories. Thank you for watching and goodbye.